This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome to the University of London and to the 2013 Wordsworth Lecture. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Michael McGregor, and I am the Robert Wolfe Director of the Wordsworth Trust. Before I launch into my opening words, I'll do one piece of housekeeping, which is, if you have one of these or something like it, could you please ensure that it's either switched off or switched to silent, and then we won't have any interruptions as we go along. Thank you very much. I'm delighted once again that we're joining with the University of London, and in particular the Institute of English Studies, to host this lecture. We're always very grateful at the Wordsworth Trust in our northern fastness for opportunities to come down to the great metropolis and wave and let people know that we're still alive and we're still thriving. And it also, for me, it's very important that it gives us an opportunity to thank those many friends, patrons and supporters who actually live down here in London and in the southeast, and who, alas, very rarely get the chance to come up to Grasmere and experience at first hand the work that we do. I just wanted to say, on behalf of the trustees and staff of the Wordsworth Trust, how much we really appreciate the support that you do give to us. For those of you in the audience, there may be one or two, alas, who are not already friends of the Wordsworth Trust, or perhaps don't even know we exist. Well, there are plenty of my colleagues around this evening. There are trustees this evening who would be more than delighted to talk to you and tell you a bit more about the work that we do. And there's also some information at the desk as well, which you can pick up and find out a bit more. Special thanks I'd like to give to the Acting Director of the Institute of English Studies, Wim van Mierlo, also to Professor Warwick Gould, who's been a long-standing collaborator with us on this lecture, and also to John Millington, who manages to get everything organised so wonderfully seamlessly at this end of things. It gives me the very greatest pleasure to introduce as the speaker for the 2013 Wordsworth Lecture, Professor Stephen Gill. Stephen is Emeritus Professor of English Literature at the University of Oxford and a Fellow of Lincoln College. He has also been, for many years, a trustee and a great supporter of the work of the Wordsworth Trust. Stephen is the author of a number of landmark works, including William Wordsworth, A Life, Wordsworth and the Victorians, and most recently, Wordsworth's Revisitings. His edition of the Salisbury Plain Poems for the Cornell Wordsworth series was the inaugural volume in what has become a landmark edition of Wordsworth scholarship. Remarkably, Stephen has also found the time to deviate a little from Wordsworth and edit a whole range of other authors, including Gaskell, Dickens, Gissing, George Eliot, and Trollope. But tonight, he's very firmly in Wordsworth territory. The subject of his talk is A Sea Rolling High, Wordsworth in 1804. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Stephen Gill.
Thank you very much, Michael. I'm honoured to be asked to give this lecture and delighted to be here and to see so many friendly faces. The first sentence of my script reads, during this talk I will be reading out quite a lot of Wordsworth's verse. I hope that is true. As of last Friday, I had no voice at all, recovering from a bout of bronchitis, and I'm still not at all sure that it's going to hold out this evening. However, my friend and colleague, Dr. Seamus Perry, sitting in the front row and uncharacteristically wearing a necktie, if I fail, will leap up here and carry on seamlessly, I would say. So we will see how we go. During this talk, I will be reading out quite a lot of Wordsworth's verse. Almost all of it on your handout. Gerard Manley Hopkins insisted that the true nature of poetry is that it is the darling child of speech, of lips and spoken utterance. It must be spoken. Till it is spoken, it is not performed. It does not perform. It is not itself. This is not true of all verse, I think, but it is so of much of Wordsworth's. Remembering his first acquaintance with poets, Hazlitt wrote about Wordsworth's equable, sustained, and internal delivery of his own verse, and how there is a chaunt in the recitation both of Coleridge and Wordsworth, which acts as a spell upon the hearer and disarms the judgment. Now, I don't want to disarm judgment, but I'm sure that when one hears the verse read out loud, especially the blank verse, difficulties fall away as its syntactical structures are grasped, and so I'm going to read out quite a lot. To begin, it is July 1803. Samuel Taylor Coleridge and Sir George and Lady Beaumont have been talking about Hazlitt's recent portrait of Wordsworth. Coleridge reports in a letter that the Beaumonts thought it conveyed a sense of Wordsworth as a profound, strong-minded philosopher. And he adds that he had said, "So it should, for that you were a great poet by inspirations and in moments of revelation, but that you were a thinking, feeling philosopher habitually, that your poetry was your philosophy under the action of strong winds of feeling, a sea rolling high." This is one of those many moments in Coleridge's letters where he throws out observations about Wordsworth's poetry that are just absolutely right. So much is compressed in his characteristically suggestive way, in this image of the sea rolling high. There is the breath of God moving on the face of the waters at the original act of creation. The strong creative breeze that opens the prelude. Coleridge's own declaration in 1796, "I feel strongly and I think strongly, but I seldom feel without thinking or think without feeling. My philosophical opinions are blended with or deduced from my feelings." Above all, there is the crisp comprehensiveness of Coleridge's summation. Your poetry was your philosophy. Taking this Coleridgean fusion, poetry and philosophy, as my prompt for this evening, I want to consider a period in Wordsworth's career when ideas, observation, linguistic struggles interact in the creation of poetry that constituted for its creator what Keats termed a regular stepping stone towards a truth, and for us, also to quote Keats, a thing of beauty that is a joy forever. That period is 1804 to 1805. We all recognise 1797-98. That was the annus mirabilis for Wordsworth, the year of lyrical ballads. One might almost call it the year of Tintern Abbey. That poem is such an assured step into greatness. What I want to suggest is that the 1804 period was the second annus mirabilis, a period in which Wordsworth's characteristic working through in poetry of ideas, flashes of insight, observations and thought, culminated in another lyric poem of enormous beauty and power, a poem that has taken to be one of the finest moments in his work, in which the poetry is the philosophy. It is, of course, the ode Intimations of Immortality, from Recollections of Early Childhood. The great 19th century scholar Mark Pattison thought that this poem represented a return to form by English poetry, which had languished ever since the composition of Milton's Lycidas. A pretty astonishing judgment, this, but not as astonishing as that of Gerard Manley Hopkins, who deemed the creation of this ode nothing less than one of those moments in history when humankind received a shock that left it all in a tremble. So Hopkins asserted in an epistolary spat with his friend Richard Dixon. These two corresponded regularly and their interchange of ideas, particularly about poetry, was very important to Hopkins. They agreed on much. But in October 1886, Hopkins was stunned by a remark of Dixon's that he thought the ode Intimations not very good even for Wordsworth, let alone great. Hopkins spluttered. He couldn't quite believe this. But yes, here it is in black and white. And so he has to remonstrate, that's Hopkins' word, remonstrate with his friend. He wrote Dixon a long and passionate letter to which we will return. In it, Hopkins insists, Wordsworth's powers rose, I hold, with the subject. The execution is so fine. The rhymes are so musically interlaced. The rhythms so happily succeed. The diction throughout is so charged and steeped in beauty and yearning. Another poet testified to the ode's power rather more arrestingly, claiming it nearly caused his death. This is Philip Larkin, being interviewed in 1979. Wordsworth was nearly the price of me once. I was driving down the M1 on a Saturday morning. They had this poetry slot on the radio, time for verse. It was a lovely summer morning, and someone suddenly started reading the Immortality Ode, and I couldn't see for tears. And when you're driving down the middle lane at 70 miles an hour, Wordsworth would not, I think, have wanted the poem to be the death of anyone, let alone of a poet who is certainly one of his descendants, but there's no doubt that he did value it very highly. When the ode was first published in Poems in 2 volumes in 1807, it was printed as the last poem in volume 2. Its special status was marked out by a separate title page, and that honour it retained in every one of the many issues of Wordsworth's collected poetical works for the rest of his life. Just as Tennyson wanted the Crossing of the Bar to conclude his edition of poems, so Wordsworth wanted the ode to stand in his collected works, both poems being, to quote Helen Tennyson, the crown of the poet's life's work. As it happens, I rather incline to the Hopkins view of the ode. But what I want to do in this lecture is not make a critical case for this poem. That would have what Henry James once called an air of superfluity about it. No, I want to contextualize it with an eye to seeing how it came into being. The ode is an impressive achievement, unlike anything Wordsworth had written before. What I want to consider is, how did it come about now, in 1804? How did it take the shape it did? And why was it so important to Wordsworth? As entry points to what I want to suggest, I take comments by 2 other great poets. One, Wordsworth's contemporary, John Keats, and the other, a profoundly Wordsworthian poet whose recent loss we all feel, Seamus Heaney. Considering revision he had made in 1818 to a passage of his long poem Endymion, Keats observed to John Taylor that he didn't expect him to value it, he being a consecutive man. But Keats added, I assure you that when I wrote it, it was a regular stepping of the imagination towards a truth. Now, here we have the artist's awareness that the truth being glimpsed is brought into graspable form in the act of composition. And it is something that Heaney articulates very eloquently in his 1974 lecture, Feeling into Words, when he's talking about technique. Technique entails the watermarking of your essential patterns of perception, voice, and thought into the touch and texture of your lines. It is the whole creative effort of the mind's and body's resources to bring the meaning of experience within the jurisdiction of form. Barely has one registered the compact power of that phrase, the jurisdiction of form, before Heaney caps it with the clinching declaration, technique ensures that the first gleam attains its proper effulgence. I want in the rest of this lecture to examine how composition of the ode and related verse was for Wordsworth a stepping of the imagination towards the truth, and to celebrate the ode in its effulgence. By the spring of 1802, William and Dorothy Wordsworth had been living in Dove Cottage in Grasmere for 15 months. The garden, which they hoped would soon make them self-sufficient in vegetables, was doing well, but with the onset of the growing season it needed fertiliser. On the 17th of March, one of their neighbours, a Mr. Olive, offered them a load of manure, and on a Saturday morning, 10 days later, he sent it. Dorothy Wordsworth recorded in her journal for the 27th of March, a divine morning. At breakfast, William wrote part of an ode. Mr. Olive sent the dung, and William went to work in the garden. We sat all day in the orchard. What a wonderful example of the conjunction of life and art that characterised the Dove Cottage years. William wrote part of an ode. The poem that Wordsworth was mulling over as he forked in the dung was the ode, There Was a Time. Consider for a moment the date, the scene, and the situation. It's Grasmere, Thomas Gray's little unsuspected paradise. After years of rootlessness and uncertain wandering, brother and sister have home at last. A greatly enlarged edition of lyrical ballads has been published, and whereas the slim volume of 1798 was issued anonymously, the second edition had Wordsworth's name on the title page. He's now before the public, and this is the moment when he must start to command an audience, if he's ever going to, and so Wordsworth is ready to take risks. In an expanded version of the preface to Lyrical Ballads, which he's writing at this moment, he advances huge claims for poetry and the almost priestly role of the poet. The poet, it is claimed, is a man speaking to men, yes, but one in the service of the most philosophic of all writing, whose object is truth, not individual and local, but general and operative. But in 1802, Wordsworth was also prey to anxieties, not one but many. They were desperately short of money. What kind of life choice was it to become a poet? Marriage to the woman he loved, Mary Hutchinson, was in the offing, but what would this mean for the family he had left behind 10 years ago in revolutionary France? When in the poem he writes at this moment, Resolution and Independence, Wordsworth contemplates Chatterton and Burns and broods on mighty poets in their misery dead. It must have been with a sharp sense of pressing realities that he declares that despite his settled life now, there may come another day to me, solitude, pain of heart, distress and poverty. The day before Mr. Olive delivered the dung, Wordsworth, according to his sister, had been having difficulties revising a poem. But while she was preparing for bed, he wrote another. It was the poem generally known as The Rainbow, and it's the first one on your sheet. My heart leaps up when I behold a rainbow in the sky. So was it when my life began. So is it now I am a man. So be it when I shall grow old, or let me die. The child is father of the man, and I could wish my days to be bound each to each by natural piety. The very next day, Wordsworth began the ode, and quite soon had shaped it into 4 stanzas. You'll all be familiar with this poem, but I want you to try to imagine for a moment what it was in those months in 1802. It had no title. It was just Ode, and it consisted of 4 stanzas. I'm going to read some of the first and some of the fourth. There was a time when meadow, grove and stream, the earth and every common sight, to me did seem apparelled in celestial light, the glory and the freshness of a dream. It is not now as it has been of yore. Turn wheresoe'er I may, by night or day, the things which I have seen, I now can see no more. The rainbow comes and goes, and lovely is the rose. The moon doth with a delight look round her when the heavens are bare. Waters on a starry night are beautiful and fair. The sunshine is a glorious birth. But yet I know, where'er I go, that there hath passed away a glory from the earth. Now you remember, the poet at this point looks round, sees joyousness and beauty and jollity around him, and speaks of attempting to empathize and join in. He hears the shouting of the happy shepherd boy. And then in the 4th stanza, "Oh, evil day, if I were sullen, while the earth herself is adorning this sweet May morning, and the children are pulling on every side, in 1,000 valleys far and wide, fresh flowers, while the sun shines warm, and the babe leaps up on his mother's arm. I hear, with joy I hear. But there's a tree of many, one, a single field which I have looked upon. Both of them speak of something that is gone. The pansy at my feet doth the same tale repeat. Whither is fled the visionary gleam? Where is it now, the glory and the dream?" Where is it now? I think the question that poem ends with is urgent and universal. Wordsworth said in later life that if his poetry were to survive at all, it would be because it deals with what concerns all of us. We have, all of us, one human heart. Right, that stanza ends. Where is it now? The glory and the dream. 2 years later, Wordsworth returned to the poem and to the question with which it ended. 2 years later. In the early months of 1804, he added a meditative section in 4 stanzas all about childhood and the passage to adulthood, and then he concluded the poem with 3 stanzas of affirmation of core conviction. I've tried to avoid, although I've just slipped into my own trap, I've tried to avoid saying that Wordsworth completed the ode. Everybody in 1804. This is what everybody says, but I don't think it's right. There's no reason to believe that when Wordsworth wrote the 4 stanzas beginning "There was a time" and read them out to Coleridge, he saw them as work in progress. They are complete in themselves, a poignant lament, an elegy for inevitable loss. By 1804, though, they'd come to seem incomplete. The cry, "Where is it now?" seemed to ask for a response, and Wordsworth was ready to suggest one. Was the second phase of composition on the ode prompted by Wordsworth's own experience of fatherhood and of infants? It seems likely. Of course, the Wordsworths already knew something about children. While living at Alfoxden in 1798, they had looked after the little boy Basil Montague, and children had always figured in the poems in such lyrics as "We Are 7" and "Anecdote for Fathers." That passage at the beginning of the prelude, beginning "Bless the infant babe," had advanced ideas about the development of consciousness from the moment the child is at the mother's breast. And one of the poems in the sequence, Personal Talk, develops the thought in the declaration that children are blessed and powerful. Their world lies more justly balanced, partly at their feet and part far from them. Yes, but there's nothing like the experience of parenthood itself, for oneself, to generate the most basic of human emotions. I quote from the poem Michael. When Michael and Luke, late in life, have the child. A child, more than all other gifts, brings hope with it and forward-looking thoughts. The first child of Wordsworth's marriage was born in June 1803, and the letters after his birth burble on about his noble countenance and so on. Sarah Coleridge had been born 6 months before, and when he saw her in the summer of 1803, Wordsworth described the child as having the most truly celestial countenance I ever beheld in a human face. But if you'd like to turn to the lines, the second lines on your sheet, we will carry on with that quotation from Michael. A child, more than all other gifts, brings hope with it, and forward-looking thoughts, and stirrings of inquietude, when they, by tendency of nature, needs must fail. Yes, anxiety, stirrings of inquietude, inevitable. And these stirrings of inquietude are touchingly voiced in the poem that Wordsworth wrote addressed to Hartley Coleridge when he was 6 years old. Responding to the energy and self-contained joyousness of the little boy, the poet addresses him with a sombre note. O blessed vision, happy child, thou art so exquisitely wild. I think of thee with many fears for what may be thy lot in future years. Perhaps these lines were coloured by memories of Al Foxton and Basil, who was now showing some signs of emotional disturbance, or perhaps by thoughts about his own son, and by the fact that his wife Mary was now pregnant with their second child. This is all speculation about children, but what is clear is that in 1804 there's a cluster of poetry around infancy, growth, ageing. Whatever part real-life children may have played in the creative energies of this moment, it's apparent that visionary children occupied a large place in the poet's imagination. And it's this body of poetry that I want to concentrate on now in the core of this lecture. The passages I want to look at embrace ideas about, first of all, innocence and its appeal. In Book 7 of the Prelude, Wordsworth recalls his period of living in the great city, when he took in as many of the shows of London as he could. And one experience takes place in an open space in a theatre, where he sees a beautiful little boy. It's on your sheet. Upon a board whence an attendant of the theatre served out refreshments had this child been placed, and there he sat, environed with a ring of chance spectators, chiefly dissolute men and shameless women, treated and caressed, ate, drank, and with the fruit and glasses played, while oaths, indecent speech, and ribaldry were rife about him, as are songs of birds in springtime after showers. The mother, too, was present, but of her I know no more than hath been said, and scarcely at this time do I remember her. But I behold the lovely boy as I beheld him then, among the wretched and the falsely gay, like one of those who walked with hair unsinged amid the fiery furnace. He hath since appeared to me oft times as if embalmed by nature, through some special privilege stopped at the growth he had, destined to live, to be, to have been, come and go, a child and nothing more. No partner in the years that bear us forward to distress and guilt, pain and abasement. Beauty in such excess adorned him in that miserable place. Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, sets up a golden idol and commands all to worship it. 3 men of Jerusalem, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, refuse and are cast into the fiery furnace. The fire is so hot, it kills the guards who throw them in. But in the furnace, they are seen to be joined by a 4th man, who is like the Son of God, and the king commands that they be let out. And the princes, governors, and captains, and the king's counselors being gathered together, saw these men, upon whose bodies the fire had no power, nor was an hair of their head singed, neither were their coats changed, nor the smell of fire had passed on them. The child's innocence, assuming in the poet's eyes a great beauty, preserves him from destruction, at least in memory. But Wordsworth knew very well that the world was not to be gainsaid, that the power of childhood, what elsewhere he calls the eagerness of infantine desire, would be tested, to use the words of Matthew Arnold, in the gradual furnace of the world, that the child must succumb to custom and the recognition of limits. One of the most astounding passages in the prelude, to my mind, provides a language for evoking this aspect of the human condition. It comes in Book 5 and it's on your sheet. In that dubious hour, that twilight, when we first begin to see the dawning earth, to recognize, expect, and in the long probation that ensues, the time of trial ere we learn to live in reconcilement with our stinted powers, to endure this state of meagre vassalage, unwilling to forego, confess, submit, uneasy and unsettled, yoke fellows to custom, mettlesome and not yet tamed and humbled down. Oh, then we feel we know when we have friends. Now, Wordsworth was always moved by the sight of those mettlesome and not yet tamed. One of the loveliest poems of the 1802 spring is called Beggars. Do you remember the poet is out and he sees a magnificent woman, a beggar woman, and he gives her some alms, but at once is accosted just a little bit down the road by 2 little lads who try it on. And he says to them, "Oh, I've just given your mother something." No, she has been dead, sir, many a day." "Sweet boys, you're telling me a lie. It was your mother, as I say, and in the twinkling of an eye." "Come, come," cried one, and without more ado, off to some other play they both together flew. Now, 15 years later, Wordsworth returned to these boys, and very strikingly to the book of Daniel, in a poem published under the title Sequel to Beggars. It opens, "Where are they now, those wanton boys?" And it ends in a sort of reprise of the poem to Hartley Coleridge. The first few lines I'm going to read are not on your sheet, but then the rest are. "The lambs," where are they now, those wanton boys? "The lambs from rock to rock were bounding, with songs the budded groves resounding, and to my heart is still endeared the faith with which it then was cheered, the faith which saw that gladsome pair walk through the fire with unsinged hair. Or, if such thoughts must needs deceive, kind spirits, may we not believe that they, so happy and so fair, through your sweet influence and the care of pitying heaven, at least were free from touch of deadly injury, destined whate'er their earthly doom, for mercy and immortal bloom. There are powerful yearnings at work in this verse. There's a strong pull towards the child as enjoying a state of being unsinged by the furnace of the world, and a counter-pull of recognition that life has to be, in Keats's phrase, a veil of soul-making, a coming to terms with loss, a reconcilement with our stinted powers. And shimmering through it all at this stage of Wordsworth's work is an awed sense of the mystery of childhood. In the summer of 1802, Wordsworth, accompanied by Dorothy, travelled to France to see Annette Vallon and his now 10-year-old daughter, Caroline. A walk taken by father and daughter on the beach at Calais is memorialised in the sonnet, "It is a Beauteous Evening." Wordsworth imagines walking up down the sand with his daughter. "Dear child, dear girl that walkest with me here, if thou appearest untouched by solemn thought, thy nature is not therefore less divine. Thou liest in Abraham's bosom all the year, and worshipst at the temple's inner shrine, God being with thee when we know it not." Now, the biblical image here, being at one with Abraham in heaven, is very familiar, and it carries no startling charge of theological implication. A passage from the prelude, though, does, or at least indicates that it might. It's on your sheet. Our childhood sits, our simple childhood sits upon a throne that hath more power than all the elements. I guess not what this tells of being past, nor what it augurs of the life to come, but so it is. And in that dubious hour, and then we return to the passage we've already looked at. This, I think, is a very important passage, and we might add it's a very characteristic one, declaring that he doesn't know what to think about pre-existence, nor about immortality. The poet declares nonetheless his conviction that somehow the simple child may hold the key, or rather, that contemplation of simple childhood may lead to penetration of what elsewhere he terms the burthen of the mystery. So, to recap, in a very short space of time, in 1804, Wordsworth struggles in poetry with ideas about childhood, about innocence, its loss, and mortality. And what emerges now, I want to suggest, is a vision of existence within its temporal and an atemporal setting, which is to become what Seamus Heaney calls the watermark of Wordsworth's mature writing. We can discern it, I think, in a powerfully assertive formulation in Book 6 of the Prelude. Do you remember in Book 6, Wordsworth is describing crossing the Alps, and that moment when he and his companion, having taken the wrong path and so on, discover that actually they've already crossed the Alps. It's a moment of great disappointment. But there's a very strange passage in which Wordsworth describes himself as being overtaken, as it were, by some power which he addresses as imagination. He's halted, struggling to break through at the moment of writing it down. And then comes these lines, which are on your sheet. In such visitings of awful promise, when the light of sense goes out in flashes that have shown to us the invisible world, doth greatness make abode. Their harbours, whether we be young or old. Our destiny, our nature, and our home is with infinitude and only there. We can see it there in that formulation, but we can discern it, I think, much more fully in the enlargement of the ode in early 1804. In the first part of this development, as I mentioned earlier, Wordsworth plays with a poetic conceit. We come from heaven trailing clouds of glory. Shades of the prison house begin to close upon the growing boy, but he continues to behold the light. But that light fades. Fades into what? Darkness? No. It fades into the light of common day. Custom, the quotidian, just growing older. The poet addresses the child, don't rush it. Soon enough, custom will lie upon thee with a weight heavy as frost and deep almost as life. This would be an appallingly melancholy end to the poem if it did end there, but it doesn't. In the second section of 1804 composition, the poet sings a song of thanks and praise, that remembrance of the time when the world seemed apparelled in celestial light continues to provide the fountain light of all our day, the master light of all our seeing, and that such recollections can uphold us, cherish us, and make our noisy years see moments in the being of the eternal silence. And thus, hence, in a season of calm weather, though inland far we be, our souls have sight of that immortal sea which brought us hither, can in a moment travel thither, and see the children sport upon the shore, and hear the mighty waters rolling evermore. Now, to repeat what I said earlier, I believe that for Wordsworth, this composition was a stepping of the imagination towards a truth, a conviction about man's state. And in the years that followed, Wordsworth made ever more assured statements of faith that in an intimation or assurance that some part of our nature is imperishable. The closing line of Wordsworth's elegy for his brother John, the Peel Castle stanzas, echoes the words of St. Paul, which are repeated in the prayer book, burial service, not without hope we suffer and we mourn. And one of the essays upon epitaphs of 1810 puts it still more eloquently, and the passage I'm alluding to is on your sheet. It comes of a section which is too long to read out in full. It's all about the kinds of questions children ask about death and origination and where the stream might lead. And it then moves on to a rather fancy formulation about immortality and the sense of it as a twin birth of reason, before rising to this climax. I confess with me the conviction is absolute, that if the impression and sense of death were not thus counterbalanced, that is, by the conviction of immortality, such a hollowness would pervade the whole system of things, such a want of correspondence and consistency, a disproportion so astounding betwixt means and ends that there could be no repose, no joy. Were we to grow up unfostered by this genial warmth, a frost would chill the spirit, so penetrating and so powerful that there could be no motions of the life of love. This essay on epitaphs was included in the annotation to the Excursion of 1814, Wordsworth's great philosophical poem, so that that piece of prose becomes part of that poem, okay? And the year after that, 1815, the ode, There Was a Time, was reprinted now as the culminating lyric in Wordsworth's first ever collected poetical works, but with a difference. It now had its own separate title page, but that reads, Ode, Intimations of Immortality from Recollections of Early Childhood. And the poem has an epigraph, lines that we started with, The child is father of the man, and I could wish my days to be bound each to each by natural piety. Yes, I think the composition of this poem was a regular stepping of the imagination towards a truth. But what kind of truth? Now there's a coda to this, without which the story of the ode is incomplete, and just touching on it will bring us to our conclusion. In 1817, 2 years after the publication of the ode in its full dress form, Coleridge singled it out for comment in chapter 22 of Biographia Literaria, or rather, he singled out the section on the child. Elsewhere in the Biographia, Coleridge writes very appreciatively about the ode, particularly sensitive to its complexities, but in chapter 22, his vexation at the image of the child as best philosopher breaks through in a long and detailed critique. Coleridge's questioning of the ode is far too familiar to need rehearsing, and you will recall his horror at a couple of lines in particular, in which the grave is imaged as being in the child's eye but a lonely bed, without the sense or sight of day or the warm light, a place of thought where we in waiting lie. Coleridge's objection had its impact, and in the next printing of the poem, in 1820, these lines were omitted. But in that same year, another critique appeared, which is perhaps less well known, but which was, I think, actually more challenging than Coleridge's in a way, because it's kind of easier to grasp. It's on your sheet. In 1821, John Taylor Coleridge, nephew of the poet, lawyer, devout Anglican, published in the High Anglican Journal, the British Critic, a substantial and highly appreciative notice of Wordsworth's poetry. Having given an account of the central stanzas of the Intimations ode, however, he observed, "A more poetical theory of human nature cannot be well devised, and if the subject were one upon which error was safe, we should forbear to examine it closely, and yield to the delight which we have often received from it in the ode from which that last extract is made. But not to say that it is unwarranted by Scripture and contradicted by common experience, we would ask him, that is Mr. Wordsworth, if he's ever considered to what consequences he must be led by the admission of its truth. If the soul of each individual comes like an emanation from the bosom of the Creator, trailing clouds of glory, pure, heavenly, and unspotted, what becomes of original sin and the fall of man? And if they are abandoned, where is the atonement? In one word, and the consequence cannot stop shorter, where is Christianity?" Now, 10 years before this, Wordsworth and Henry Crabb Robinson had been talking on just these matters, and Robinson noted in his journal, he was so appalled by this, he noted it in code, he noted in his journal, Wordsworth said, "I have no need of a redeemer." What can he have meant? But of one thing I'm sure, the doctrine of original sin was anathema to Wordsworth. Wordsworth brooded over the charge levelled by John Taylor Coleridge and others like him for more than 20 years. And in 1843, he addressed it in a note dictated to the notes that we call the Fenwick Notes, 1843. The date is important. It's on your sheet. In youth, I was often unable to think of external things as having external existence, and I communed with all that I saw as something not apart from, but inherent in, my own immaterial nature. Many times while going to school have I grasped at a wall or tree to recall myself from this abyss of idealism to the reality. At that time I was afraid of such processes. In later periods of life I have deplored, as we all have reason to do, a subjugation of an opposite character, and have rejoiced over the remembrances, as is expressed in the lines, obstinate questionings, etc., to that dreamlike vividness and splendour which invests objects of sight in childhood. Everyone, I believe, if he would look back, could bear testimony, and I need not dwell upon them here. But, having in the poem regarded it as presumptive evidence of a prior state of existence, I think it right to protest against a conclusion which has given pain to some good and pious persons, that I meant to inculcate such a belief. It is far too shadowy a notion to be recommended to faith as more than an element in our instincts of immortality. But let us bear in mind that though the idea is not advanced in Revelation, there is nothing there to contradict it. I took hold of the notion of pre-existence as having sufficient foundation in humanity for authorizing me to make for my purpose the best use of it as I could as a poet. Now, I love the defiance of that final sentence. This is 1843, not 1803. The Christian revival is in full swing. Wordsworth's brother Christopher was a churchman red hot in orthodoxy. He believed in 40 articles. His nephew was a bishop. His own son was a clergyman of the Church of England. On all sides, Wordsworth was beset with people attentive to deviation from the prayer book and the 39 articles. So what does he do? First, he reminds all such that the idea of pre-existence has a foundation in humanity. And second, that he is a poet. And what Wordsworth thought the role of the poet was had been broadcast in every reprinting of the preface to Lyrical Ballads for the last 40 years. As a poet, yes. And there's only one way to end this lecture after such a declaration. It's by hearing just a bit more of what Wordsworth's best use amounted to. And that must be from the climactic lines of the ode, in which Wordsworth once again affirms the conviction expressed in Tintern Abbey that for loss there is abundant recompense. What though the radiance which was once so bright be now forever taken from my side? Though nothing can bring back the hour of splendour in the grass, of glory in the flower, we will grieve not, rather find strength in what remains behind, in the primal sympathy which having been must ever be, in the soothing thoughts that spring out of human suffering, in the faith that looks through death, in years that bring the philosophic mind. And O ye fountains, meadows, hills and groves, think not of any severing of our loves, yet in my heart of hearts I feel your might. I only have relinquished one delight, to live beneath your more habitual sway. I love the brooks which down their channels fret, even more than when I tripped lightly as they. The innocent brightness of a newborn day is lovely yet. The clouds that gather round the setting sun do take a sober colouring from an eye that hath kept watch o'er man's mortality. Another race hath been, and other palms are won. Thanks to the human heart by which we live, thanks to its tenderness, its joys and fears, to me the meanest flower that blows can give thoughts that do often lie too deep for tears. In the letter to Diction with which we started, Hopkins declared, "For my part, I should think that St. George and St. Thomas of Canterbury wore roses in heaven for England's sake on the day that ode was penned." I'm sure I think so too.